Welcome back, or welcome to the Rebel Tech Podcast, where we discuss the promises and perils of emerging technology. And if you're an active listener, you know that this means everything, not just the economics, but the socio-cultural, the policy implications, and how technology affects our everyday interactions and lives. And I'm David Dunmoyer, your host for today's discussion, campaign director for Better Tech for Tomorrow. And this is the fourth episode in a 5-part series that we're doing on our legislative priorities for the 2025 legislative session, 89th legislature. And today, I am honored to have a good friend and colleague on the show today, Greyson, who is a phenomenal policy scholar with the foundation, who has really worked a number of issues, but we have selfishly brought you onto our team as one of the great go-getter researchers in so many of the emerging tech issues. So first and foremost, Greyson, welcome to the Rebel Tech Podcast.
Well, thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about right to repair today. And I know you've done a lot of research on this. You spent a lot of time in the trenches figuring out how we are going to be effective advocates on this for next session. By way of illustrating this issue, because this is something, we'll get into your background on it. I used to work in California politics, and I remember when looking at tech policy initially, right to repair was really one of the more nascent emerging tech policy issues. And it's still emerging because it hasn't been fully addressed. And the way I want to contextualize this discussion, then you're going to add so many great things to it, is I don't have my smartphone on me, so I can't use a prop. But for our viewers, think of it this way. Your smartphone, a device that you rely on for navigation, for steps, for emails, whatever it might be, this is an integral part of your life, professionally, personally, and otherwise. It stops working. This happens all the time. And you go to take your phone into a repair shop only to find out that the manufacturer has restricted the access to necessary parts to make the repair unless you bring it directly into the Apple store or wherever your phone may be manufactured. And so you can't go to that third-party repair store, and you realize that the cost of repairs are going to be such that it probably makes sense to buy a new phone. And as consumer rights advocates, this really frustrates me because we don't have basic transparency. We don't have information symmetries to know what the actual issue is. So lo and behold, I end up getting the new iPhone when it could have just been a screen repair. Of course, there's much more to it than this, but it's the idea that, do I actually own my iPhone? And I'm going to ask you that question later, but is that a correct way of introducing this topic? How would you add to that?
I think it is. Right to repair is essentially the notion that you own the property that you purchase. Whether it's your smartphone or a wheelchair for enhanced mobility, whether it's your John Deere tractor, whether it's your car, you have the right to do as you wish with your own personal property. It seems like a really simple issue, but there's so much complexity, especially as you get into things like the notion of intellectual property that these companies have when they create these products. Like, they spend billions of dollars in research and development, and then they sell them to you to be a user. But at the same time, do they have a certain degree of control over that device because they spent so much in producing it? Wherein on the other side, you're the consumer, you've purchased the product, you have compensated the company for taking the product that they sell, and it's yours. Now, it's not anybody else's, it's yours. And so it gets down to very fundamental questions of ownership, of property, and dives into some intellectual properties, law and philosophy as well.
Yeah. Well, and we'll, I'm sure, get into that. Even the way you're explaining it there's this reflexive impulse to, plant your flag in the hill and say, this is my property.
Yeah.
And, you've talked about and written about how there's really movement surrounding right to repair. I'd love if you can just break down what's the history behind the right to repair movement.
Yeah.
What are some of the big contours that you found in your research and advocacy?
Yeah, well, so the right to repair movement, because all of the different devices and equipment that is sold, because it literally applies to everything. So in all these different industries, there have been those who, because they can't repair their device, then join the right to repair movement. So it's the gamut of all the different devices and types of products that are sold. But it's most prevalent within tech spaces, I'd say. So because obviously this little cell phone here that everyone's glued to, that's the thing that most often is damaged.
Sure.
Be it a screen that breaks, be it you drop it in the water, or water resistant doesn't necessarily mean waterproof. And so you end up with a fried phone, like all those different types of things. And so it most often plays out in the dynamic between consumer electronics manufacturers and their consumers. But it also is applicable to so many different industries.
Yeah.
But the history of right to repair really is rooted in the notion of planned obsolescence.
Okay.
Which,
yeah, you told me a thing or two about cartels in
gosh.
really every industry. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I'm going to get there. It's really frustrating that this is even a problem, but hey, we're going to find a solution, hopefully.
Yep.
But so if you're like me, you've had grandparents who used to, they'll just say things like, oh, well, they just don't make them like they used to, referring to a car or like a refrigerator or something like that. But in my research about this issue, that's literally the truth. They don't make things like they used to, and it was by design. And so the notion of planned obsolescence was an economic theory that developed in the Great Depression era. There are these two guys, and you're going to learn a lot about this. I'm going to read from them. Roy Sheldon and Egmont Arons were their names. They wrote a book in the aftermath of the Great Depression, where obviously demand was low because nobody had any money, and they were trying to figure out how to restart the economy. And so what they did was they said, there's no reason to make things to last anymore. To stimulate the economy, all we need to do is just make things that suck so that then people can buy more things. I'm going to read from their book. Yep. It's just like the most infuriating thing. Quote, planned obsolescence is another device for stimulating consumption. The element of style is a consideration in buying many things. Clothes go out of style and are replaced long before they're worn out. Does there seem to be a sad waste in the process? Not at all. Wearing things out does not produce prosperity, but buying things does. Any plan which increases the consumption of goods is justifiable if we believe that property is a desirable thing. If we do not, we can turn back to the page to an earlier and more primitive time when people got along with little and made everything last as long as possible. We've built up a complicated industrial machine and we must go on with it or throw it into reverse and go backwards. So these were two people who were representative of the time, and they basically said the only way we're going to restore our economy is if we quit making quality goods, which is just like, are you kidding me? But in the time, I think they had reasons to think the way they did. Obviously, unprecedented economic disruption. But that theory rooted its way into every single industry, and most famously, you mentioned the cartel earlier. There was a cartel of light bulb manufacturers who, I don't know if they named themselves this or if they were just, this name was given to them, but the Phoebus cartel, which was a group of international manufacturers who decided to limit the lifetime of light bulbs. Because you've got, it's like the early 1900s, Thomas Edison, you got the light bulb. There were some earliers in the late 1800s, but essentially the light bulb was just getting better and better and better. They were testing new filaments, they were testing new gases to put into the gas bulb, and light bulbs. There's still a light bulb to this day in California, actually, in the storage room of a fire, fire department, like storage unit, basically, that's got a light bulb from like the 1900s that's still burning. And it was one of the last few that still exist. But they were seeing very quickly how they were going to go out of business if they made a light bulb that just never went out. And so the notion of planned obsolescence was then taken up by these light bulb manufacturers who then said, all right, we need to limit the lifetime of our light bulb so that we can continue selling light bulbs ad nauseum.
I mean, this really, I know this isn't a critique on mass consumerism, but I mean, you have all the wheels in my head spinning here. The offshoring of manufacturing, cheaper goods made overseas, this notion that in America we tend to acquire more and more and more things. I'm not advocating for minimalism, although I think there is something inherently good about that more aesthetic philosophy, but this is by design. So what you're articulating here is that this has fed into iPhones, where we're at today, automobiles, and so on and so forth. So I guess I should ask this. How many Americans do you think understand this concept? Not to be like ivory tower beard stroking, but
Sure.
I think this notion of planned obsolescence, the Wall Street Journal writes about it, Washington Post. Have you found in your research that this resonates with people? Like, yeah, they don't make it like they used to anymore. For me, it certainly does. Just curious, your read on that.
Well, they know that their devices break,
Yeah.
and they know that they have to replace a refrigerator more times than they think they should be able to, and things are only getting worse.
Yeah.
So they're very much aware of the problem. They obviously aren't probably super tuned into the notion of planned obsolescence and all these kind of things. But like the idea of needing to replace things because they break is obviously very prevalent. Some polling from Consumer Reports I found that was really interesting. 8 out of 10 Americans say that they've, in the past 5 years, replaced at least one of their like items, be it smartphones or home appliances or et cetera. 57% of Americans said that they didn't have enough choices when it came to getting repairs for their products, which then compelled them to like go out and seek new products.
Yeah.
And from Consumer Reports, again, most Americans, so about 84%, say that they would agree with a policy that would require manufacturers to make repair information and parts available through either the industry or the company that created the product, or through independent repair professionals.
Yeah.
And so that 84% represents a majority of the public who would be in favor of the type of thing that we're hoping to address in Texas, which is the notion of right to repair.
Yeah, well, perfect jumping off point. Well, I think it was you, Greyson, who was telling me the story about the couple, the gentleman who had a wheelchair and needed repairs on it. And they sent out the technician, and it was as simple. The repair that needed to happen would have allowed him to have mobility in his wheelchair. The technician comes, presses a singular button on the iPad, and it's reactivated.
Yep.
And if they had that transparency to know, okay, A, someone could have done this remotely, or B, the wife, the caretaker, et cetera, that's something that should easily be done at their own home.
Yeah. Well, and those things are self-imposed by the manufacturers.
Right.
So
right.
They have created entire industries of repair to they argue, for the sake of protecting their intellectual property rights.
Right.
But in the case of this man's wheelchair, if it's something that his wife, his primary caretaker, could have just pressed a button on her own and didn't need a special access code or some sort of software to get into it, would save everybody time and hassle.
Yeah.
In the same way, I mean, in talking about the sort of agricultural applications for this, because there are, most famously, John Deere and others have maintained strict control over the repair of their tractors. So much so that like you can't fix a John Deere tractor, even if it's just a simple like a software issue. You have to load it up on a trailer, take it to the authorized retailer, and then have them press a few buttons on their laptop or their iPad, and then it's good to go. This, like, the applications and the consequences for this are just innumerable. Because you've got, if it's prime growing season and you've got a field of wheat that has got to be harvested and has got to be stored so that the timing of the aging is right, so then you're able to sell it on the market. So that, because if you're aiming for like a high quality wheat, there's very particular guidelines about when you can harvest, when you can plant, all these things. And so if you've got to shut down operations to then have your tractor towed off to a repair shop, which is probably, it could be hours away. Depending, in rural communities, it just causes so much chaos and unnecessary frustration for these farmers.
And you're characterizing what is a common theme of Better Tech for Tomorrow, or advocacy broadly, which is technology is a tool. It can be used for good or it can be used for harm. And this introduces kind of I don't want to say unique, but it is unique to this this policy question here, the double-edged sword nature between consumer and manufacturer. As a broad question, what is the double-edged sword component that's happening with the right to repair movement, with manufacturing of devices for planned obsolescence? What are some of the unique harms that this is creating for that, again, consumer versus manufacturer side?
Yeah, well, it's easy to claim that this is a black and white issue, but once you get down to the root of the problem, you can kind of see both sides. And so, as we mentioned earlier, the notion of intellectual property versus private property rights of the individual. There's a reason that Apple, for example, just not to pick on anybody, but just to mention them, there's a reason that they don't just release all of the design plans and the technical like charts for all their devices to the public. I mean, obviously they want to protect their intellectual property and keep like, competitors from then using that to their advantage or whatever. So like that's a valid concern. But at the same time, there is the notion that we talked about earlier, which is that when you purchase an item, it's yours. And this is not just some made up malarkey. This is a real notion that, I mean, it's legal precedent in the Western world for as long as we've all been around, at least in English common law, all the way up through the American Constitution. Private property rights are foundational to civilization. And so the idea that you have to, you are inhibited in some way from exercising full control over your property because of these restrictions that are imposed after point of purchase, it's a tension that policymakers need to deal with responsibly. Because, like I said, Apple and all these different companies have legitimate claims to intellectual property, but at the same time, I think that Americans and the people in different countries deserve more complete control over the property that they purchase.
Well, then to jump into that tension, I know certain states have passed legislation or at least introduced legislation on right to repair. How are lawmakers in different states, nationally in Texas, how are they addressing this from a public policy perspective? What are we seeing in the movement as it's realizing itself into legislative action?
Yeah, so there are about 30 states currently that are entertaining right to repair legislation. So that's either very like industry-specific bills on consumer electronics or home appliances, or some have been more broad, encompassing all goods sold in the state. And there are nonprofit organizations like iFixit, for example, which gives repair tutorials online. They've set up a shop where they've provided model legislation for the federal government, for the federal legislature rather, to enact some of these things to impose restrictions on producers of the goods that they sell. But it's a varied mix right now. There is model legislation, like I said, but primarily it's an issue that it's been interesting because companies like Apple and like Samsung and others have seen the complaints of the general public and have decided instead to ignore, they've decided to be responsive to those. So for example, for Apple's case in Oregon, I think it was, they testified as their legislature was considering a bill in favor, actually, of the right to repair in the state of Oregon. And they have made public promises to expand public access to repair manuals and to parts also. And that's the other the aspect of this, is that the companies maintain control over part supplies. And so what'll happen is if you are trying to get your screen repaired at a local phone shop and they use a part that's not from the original manufacturer, they'll like void your warranty. They'll void your warranty, or they'll cause it to be where the screen isn't, like a software block pops up and you can't, it like bricks your phone because you didn't use an original manufacturer part. But Apple and others are expanding their willingness to provide independent retailers with the parts and the manuals to make these repairs. And so it's certainly a step in the right direction, and they're doing it just even at the threat of legislation, not even with actually complying to the legislation that's being considered.
So, I mean, the natural next question, you laid out 84% of Americans, support what is the general animating concept of right to repair. You have Apple entering state houses and saying, actually, this is good, and we're going to take a kind of private sector approach to doing this even before legislation. So who's opposed? What's the opposition? What are they saying? And when they're coming into states like Texas or Arizona, wherever it might be, to kill these bills, who are those groups and why are they against this?
Well, I mean, it's primarily industry. It's not everyone has taken a positive perspective on these things, and they stick very closely to their intellectual property claims. There are those also, even just outside of it in a more philosophical realm, that are claiming that this is not a responsibility of government. They're taking a much more perhaps libertarian approach to the use of government in intervening in the practices of industry. And so those are the primary opponents to this kind of thing. But it seems to me, and just in my assessment of it, that the momentum is shifting towards the right to repair, as obviously, like I said, that 84%, as the vast majority of Americans recognize the need for this kind of thing, their lawmakers, their congressmen and their senators who supposedly represent them, are waking up to the fact that this is an issue. And so I think that in years prior, this has been an issue where the legislatures have been able to ignore it because the public wasn't super aware of it. But as the movement has sort of coalesced, it's come time now for lawmakers to be responsive to their constituents.
And, the 84%, to get back to that, and we can, based on your analysis, reasonably deduce the 16%. And what their interest, pecuniary or otherwise, might be in killing right to repair legislation. Even in my research and looking at this issue, it really is amazing to see who's come into this fold. You have a lot of the IT community online, whether it's, I know our great IT team here, we talked to them about this extensively, and a lot of the more autodidactic folks who want to learn how to repair technology themselves or something innately dignified about understanding your technology, understanding your automobile, your tractor, whatever it may be. And then, so the tractor point, to farmers in Texas that we've talked to about this could not be a more perfect breeding ground for really upset rural Texans who intentionally or otherwise are in rural areas because they want to have more independence. They want to have more autonomy. And here, to your point, as you laid out perfectly, they can't harvest their own wheat without taking their tractor to the John Deere repair store.
Right.
So with all that and knowing, where the forces are in Texas and across the country, this really is characterized correctly as a movement. And the movement continues to evolve with technology, with new threats or new corporate interests. I'm just curious, what do you think a group like this, what kind of potency will they have in shaping technology policy in the right to repair movement and perhaps otherwise, if there's any other things you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think, they will be very potent in their ability to shape legislation. And touching on earlier what I was talking about with the notion that constituents are waking up to the reality that they face. The savings, so there's two ways to look at this, because you've got an entire industry that can come up out of this. Independent repair shops. They're few and far between nowadays, but for those who are more technically inclined and love, tinkering with things, working on technology, this provides them an opportunity to set up a repair shop in a local, like my hometown, for example, who's probably 2 hours away from an Apple store. If I wanted to get my phone repaired, I either have to ship it in or just get a new phone, order it offline. So the idea of then being able to go to a local person who you know and trust, and they've set up a shop, have them repair it, they can repair it for 3 times less than you could getting a repair from the original manufacturer.
Yeah.
So it's cost savings. The Public Interest Research Institute did a study where they said that Americans could save a total of $40 billion annually if they were able to go through independent repair shops. And that's borne out across the country in every market, from New York to rural East Texas. The ability to repair the property that you own is not only further bolstering your own property rights, it's also saving you time and money. And so this is one of the rare instances where public policy can seriously, and immediately impact the lives of everyday people. And I think that it's a great example of not only just, it's a bipartisan issue also. This is really just a home run for legislators who want to consider being responsive to their constituents.
Well, let's cut an advertisement to kind of conclude this discussion here. As you mentioned earlier on, yourself as well as co-host, colleague Zach Whiting not published yet, but authored a fantastic research paper which explores the legal background, everything you've identified today about the movement and its political, philosophical, cultural impetus and policy recommendations. So that paper will be live in the coming weeks here. But let's cut an advertisement. What are we advocating for? What is the policy recommendation? Perhaps succinctly, what does right to repair in Texas look like?
Yeah. Well, right to repair in Texas looks like the guarantee that you own the property that you purchase. And it's the opportunity for everyday people to acquire the parts and the repair services necessary to continue using the property that they've already purchased. Oh. And this is all across the board. It's from the farmers to the teachers to the scientists and the businessmen in the country. Yeah. They are able to then say, I am able to acquire parts the way I'd like, and it further bolsters, like I said, the property rights that they already have endowed to them by both nature and the laws of this country. Yeah. So, like I said, it's really a home run. And so I look forward to seeing how this plays out in the next legislative session. I am hopeful that it'll take traction and there won't be too much industry opposition. But the future is bright for the right to repair in the state of Texas.
Some would say brighter than the planned obsolescence of light bulbs of years of yore. So
yes, full circle. Yeah.
Full circle. It all comes back to the cartel. Well, Greyson, thank you for your time, efforts, advocacy on this. And for folks listening, as I mentioned, we'll have that research paper in the coming weeks here. So if this is a topic you're interested in, be on the lookout for that. And certainly an issue that we hope will transpire during the next legislative session, and we'll keep you updated on that. For the time being, you know where to go, texaspolicy.com. All of our tech policy research, commentary, and so on. And until the next episode, Greyson, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. See you next time.